Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report Special Summer Solutions, where we look at the solutions. I'm here with Stacy Herbert, and we've got a special guest, Stacy.
Right, Alasdair Macleod of goldmoney.com. He writes amazing pieces over there, lots of blog posts, research, and all sorts of stuff. I recommend you check it out. Your latest pieces, Alasdair, are called Too Much Liquidity and Inflation, Asset, and Consumer Prices. So this is definitely the biggest theme of 2021, and that is inflation. Even the U.S. Federal Reserve is admitting now that there is quite a bit of inflation. The numbers are over 5%, the official numbers that they report to the U.S. And however, first of all, is this inflation transitory, as they say? Or do you think this is going to be a bit more permanent, as the head of the Central Bank of Russia has recently just said?
I'm afraid it's a bit more permanent than transitory. The problem basically is that you can see, going back to March last year, how commodity prices just took off. And they took off at exactly the moment that the Fed decided to do QE of 120 billion a month. And not only that, but as we come out of lockdown, we find two things. Firstly, there's a complete logistical foul up. Nothing is getting delivered. We went into it with just-in-time inventory management, which means there was nothing on the shelves. And on top of that, we find to our displeasure that people, having stopped working, don't want to go back to work. So you can see that there is not the product available to match all that money that's been handed to the consumers. And the consequence is quite simple. Prices rise. And not only do they rise, but they will continue rising until that situation is sorted out at the minimum. But of course, the monetary inflation continues. So will it ever get sorted out? I'm afraid that it's actually a very serious situation, and it'll only be a matter, I think, of a month or two, or perhaps even a few weeks before the currency markets begin to reflect the fact that interest rates have got to rise in order to protect currencies against the debasement that we have seen so far. So I think, as far as the Fed is concerned, I think they were trying very hard not to precipitate a situation which is already there. But I'm afraid it is there. It is not transient. It is permanent, and it's going to prove to be extremely expensive for the consumer.
So you talk about 120 billion money printing per month, or QE per month. So my question is this: we came through an era of programs, various programs, whether it's QE1, QE2, the TARP bailout after the 2008 crisis. But it seems like we fundamentally entered into a new era where they're not even trying to create these programs. They're just saying this is an automatic line item every month, 120 billion printed. And so we've entered into a new era where there is actually, this is an outstanding feature of policy now. It's no longer a program. It's no longer responding to anything, but it's a reinterpretation of the economy from the most fundamental level. Alasdair.
Well, it started off in the wake of the Lehman crisis as extraordinary measures. And unfortunately, instead of the extraordinary measures going away, they have continued. And not only have they continued, but they've become yet more extraordinary. I mean, it is no solution. The problem, there was a phrase a little while ago about kicking the can down the road. I mean, it looks to me as if we're running out of road to kick that can down. Really, I'm afraid that the central banks have got themselves into one enormous mess on this, and it's very, very difficult to see how they can get out of it. And I know that I've mentioned before that really their objective has been to try and keep the show on the road, kick that can down the road, as it were, by puffing up asset values, by ensuring that the yields on US Treasury bonds don't rise, that they are suppressed, that we all get a wealth effect from rising stock prices, to which they can now add cryptocurrencies. I mean, there's this sort of, we've got to keep fueling the bubble, keep pumping the bubble. And that's really what they've been doing. But of course, there comes a point where you can no longer do that. And this is the importance of the inflation message that we're getting, because it will mean that interest rates have got to rise. What happens to that asset bubble? The asset bubble collapses. It's as simple as that. Now, as soon as that begins to happen, we then look and see what is the Fed's response going to be. Well, the answer is quite simple. They're going to have to up QE from 120 billion a month to, say, 200 billion a month, maybe 250 billion a month, in order to keep the asset bubble inflated. So, I mean, can we imagine this? This is yet more extraordinary measures. It is absolutely crazy. And there is actually no way out of it. They've basically run out of road.
The Fed, what they do with this whole Fed speak is it's about managing perception, trying to stoke animal spirits. But this mind shift in the population, as you mentioned, nobody wants to work. They all got a little bit of taste of what it feels like to be a cantillionaire, right? The Fed gives you free money. Here is the Treasury is giving them free money, and it feels nice. Like, who doesn't want to spend time with their family, lounge around at home, watch daytime television, get manicures and pedicures all day? Like, who wouldn't want to live like that? But the point is that supply chain. Like, is China going to continue to send us stuff for this money when, like, it becomes more obvious the fraud, the underlying fraud of this fiat system is like, here, the people printing the money, none of them are having to work. Like, where's the wealth coming from to back this?
Well, the wealth comes by being transferred from the very people who it's meant to benefit. I mean, it's that crazy. If you dilute the purchasing power of a currency, then obviously you're diluting everybody's salary, their savings, and everything else. Now, there are compensating factors. If you use the dilution to puff up the asset values of one's stocks, then people who've got stocks are going to benefit. But the people who haven't don't benefit. If anything, they end up paying for it. And it really does disadvantage the position of everybody in society who is at the lowest level. It is the reverse of what socialism is meant to do. It is financially crippling for virtually everybody. I mean, the prices that are rising at the moment, very obviously, are of essentials. I mean, you're looking at energy, for example. You're looking at the food commodities, like live hogs and quinoa and all the rest of it. These are the basic things that people need, and they're having to pay through the nose in order to get it. And the reason that this is the case is not because there is so much a specific problem with quinoa or with live hogs or whatever it is because the purchasing power of the currency is going down. And the thing that's fascinating is that the Keynesian crowd, who basically are the establishment, don't seem to have spotted this. I mean, they just, when they talk about things like copper prices rising, it's always specific to copper. They never realize that it's the purchasing power of the currency that's going down, because it's a common factor amongst all the commodity all the list of commodities. So this is not good. It really isn't. And the only way that this progresses, well, there are two ways it progresses. Either the Fed does something for which it has no mandate whatsoever. It stands back and says, look, we're going down the wrong path. We've got to stop this. We're going to stop money printing, and everybody's just got to make their own arrangements. Now, I really cannot see that, first of all, they've got the guts to do that, and secondly, that they've got the mandate to do that. And probably the mandate is the most important thing. The other alternative is to just continue accelerating printing and just hope. But the problem with this printing is it's not so much a rerun, if you like, of the great inflations that we saw after the First World War in Europe. It's more this John Law situation, where they have specifically used the fiat currency to increase its quantity in order to go into the market and buy stocks, buy bonds, and puff up asset prices. And we know what happened with John Law's Mississippi bubble. It burst. And this was despite the fact that he was controller of the currency in France. He was able to print as many livres as he liked, and still the bubble popped. And I'm afraid that, to my mind, is the precedent for what we're seeing now.
Let's talk about something else slightly, and that would be not only a failure of policy, but I guess you could call it a failure of intellectual, in that the model itself, because you talk about there being too much liquidity. So the Fed and the Treasury are saying that more money printing would lead to more supply, but there's been no expansion of production, and without that, there's no supply, because all the money printing is causing misallocation of capital. The supply chain is breaking down. And so the point here is that this is part of their model, their belief system. Not only are they printing too much money and it's causing problems, but they also suffer from acute mental dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty. Why can't they just see that they're failing? Why can't they see that? And why don't they correct their course? Is it fate? Is it fate that's driving us off the cliff, or is it just rank suicide mission?
I think, well, the lemming instinct. I think it's intensely human. I mean, when you're embarked on a policy for which you have committed entirely, you follow that to the bitter end, even though there is conflicting evidence suggesting that you should have stopped pursuing this policy. I mean, I've done this myself in the past in life. We've all done it to an extent. But when it's so much easier to observe it in others. And you've got this sort of thing. I mean, all these guys on the FOMC, and we've got the equivalent in the UK here with the Monetary Policy Committee. I mean, they're all reinforcing their own beliefs. Every time they meet, they tell the same story to themselves, almost as if it's to reassure themselves that they are right and everybody else is wrong. And so I think the answer to what you're saying, Max, is it is an intensely human situation. And unfortunately, I just don't see how they're going to change from this. I think it's a great pity because they're just destroying. I mean, just imagine if you've suddenly got no dollars, if you have no dollars, no dollars in the sense that the money doesn't buy anything, then you don't have any pounds, you don't have any euros, because everything depends on the dollar. The dollar goes, it all goes. This is going to be, if it happens, and assuming that they don't take action to stop it, this is actually a disastrous scenario we're talking about.
All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more with Alasdair Macleod of goldmoney.com. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to the seer of London, the great knowledge base at goldmoney.com. Alasdair Macleod, welcome back to part 2. All right, so Alasdair, let me ask you this. So what we're describing here, it seems like it's an institutional blindness. As you pointed out, there's lemmings are jumping off the cliff, but we have some dissenters. So El Salvador, a small country in Latin America, has decided to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, and the president openly says that money printing's a fraud. The third richest man in Mexico has come out and said money printing is a fraud. The dollar is a fraud. They're also leaning toward Bitcoin. And let's talk about Russia. They divested completely out of U.S. dollars. And, they're making moves now to suggest that they are concerned about, in other words, they've opted out of the system. Are these, looking ahead into the future, will these two countries be remembered as the smart ones?
Well, I mean, time will tell. But the one thing that is absolutely clear, and for this we must note what Bitcoin has done, is it's alerted people who otherwise would not be alerted to what the central banks are doing. Now, whether Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency is an escape from this, only time will tell. And it's up to people to select their money rather than, let's say, you or I or politicians in El Salvador and so on. But the one thing that is absolutely clear to me is that people this time round are learning far earlier in the debasement process that currencies are being debased. And I think the consequence of this is that once the purchasing power of fiat currencies really begins to decline, I think it will be a far more rapid process as a result of this understanding.
We're talking about the summer solutions to this. So I want to ask you, is just the natural cycle of life going to be the solution? I.e., we have a generational shift. The Ponzi scheme that the likes of us say, the all fiat US dollar world is. That started in 1971. It turns 50 in August. The boomers in America are retiring. They've got these huge, they own all the portfolios. You were talking about the stock markets. The property markets are up 25%. They own the vast majority of these paper assets that have gone up tremendously. The new generation of Z and millennials, they have nothing from that. So the revolution is that they're just going to opt out of it with Bitcoin, with gold, with just a different lifestyle, and their vote, of course, because as the boomers die off, they have less and less impact on on politicians and how they allocate all this free money. So is that natural change in generation, is that going to end this Ponzi scheme once and for all?
That could have something to do with it, but I think it's a lot more to do with the fact that I think we look at what happens to monetary inflation perhaps in two phases. I mean, since 1971, when we came off the last remnants of the gold standard, the dollar has lost, certainly measured in gold, purchasing power of over 98%. Now, I don't think many people are aware of that loss of purchasing power. It has been a gradual thing, and we have sort of managed to compensate for it by buying property, gearing up property with mortgages, by buying stocks, and so on and so forth. So we've managed through the assets to create an offsetting wealth effect. Now, that is fine, so long as the loss of purchasing power of a fiat currency is a gradual and continual unvarying phenomenon. But when you get a situation where suddenly the purchasing power of the currency starts declining more rapidly, I think we enter a different phase. And this is what I'm detecting now. I mean, I can see that the amount of money that's been printed in the name of creating or financing the government's budget deficit is really taking monetary inflation into a new level. And this is likely to undermine confidence in its purchasing power, partly because of what we were just discussing now about the realization in the modern generation exactly what central banks are doing. And when this really happens, I think that we're then in a different phase, because you will see the asset values which protected you in the past start losing value. And they start losing value because there's a completely different set of dynamics. I mean, for example, when you look at property, in a hyperinflation, property moves from being a protector for the individual against monetary inflation to being a liability. I mean, when your rentals can't keep up with the debasement of the currency, and when the cost of maintaining property is greater than you can possibly afford because it is rising so rapidly, then suddenly your property is a liability. It's no longer an asset. Now, there is obviously a value in having a roof over your own head. I mean, owning a home. There is a utility in that, if you like. But suddenly you see that there's this huge, great shift. Now, if we refer back to what happened in Germany back in 1923, what pushed up property prices in local currencies was foreign interest. You had foreigners who had dollars, which were convertible into gold, and you could buy a very large house in a lovely suburb of Berlin for $100, which was slightly less than 5 ounces of gold. And that was the sort of price that you were paying in the beginning of 1923. And also, there were dollars coming in the whole time because you had a two-speed economy. You had the economy which worked really from exports, which earned dollars coming in. You had the capital inflows from foreigners taking advantage of if you like, the poverty of the middle classes. And they were able to buy property, estates, and all the rest of it. Now, this time around, if we have a collapse of paper currencies, we don't have that foreign influence. So suddenly we're looking at something which is potentially a lot more disastrous than what Germany experienced in 1922-23.
Now, you've outlined here 3 points. So You're talking about asset prices are protection typically for the rich against inflation, but that could be running into trouble because in the case of property, the maintenance costs and et cetera are going to strip out or not keep up. So that becomes a liability, not an asset, as you point out. The second thing is that on the other end of the economic spectrum for poor people, this phenomenon that's happened with the money printing has come concurrently with, in the case of America, outsourcing labor to China. So in America, they don't necessarily on the poor side speculate on property, but they have a benefit in cheaper goods, cheaper electronics, cheaper clothes, cheaper gas, right? So that's the poor man's asset appreciation, is getting cheap stuff from abroad, right? So, and you're saying that this is also now under threat because prices at Walmart and prices at the gas station or petrol quart, as I believe you call it, are now going up for real. I mean, even the highly manipulated CPI is at 5%, and with the actual numbers at 10 to 12%. And so you've got a double-sided dilemma, which I think is different than any other dilemma before, because we didn't have that great outsourcing of labor that came when with China became became the global factory. So I guess that's adding to your thesis here that even the hyperinflation of the Germany in the 20s could pale by comparison because of this kind of a double whammy, to put it in colloquial terms, Alasdair.
Yes, that's I think right, and we can encapsulate it with a very, very simple observation, and that is that there will continue to be demand for human life essentials. I mean, of that I think we can all agree on. But when it comes to non-essentials, which could be computers or whatever, then under those circumstances, then there's no point in manufacturing them if people are not going to buy them. So you can see that the vast amount, and particularly service industries would be hit very, very hard by this loss of purchasing power of currencies.
So again, back to solutions. Is the solution going to be the end of the US dollar as a reserve currency? Because underlying all of this is really that Triffin dilemma. The problem of the Triffin dilemma is that if you have a domestic currency as the international reserve currency, the domestic economy, in this case the US, has to run massive trade deficits, which causes so much instability domestically at home, but also in the trade situation. Does that have to end to provide the ultimate solution to this situation? And what does it look like post US dollar?
Yes, well, I mean, the Triffin dilemma always ends with a crisis because you are forced to, as a country providing the reserve currency, you are forced to undertake or undergo economic policies which are destructive of your own economy. And there comes a point where the world has then got enough. And at that stage, it starts going into reverse. And we have this now. I mean, if you look at the Treasury tick figures, you'll see that foreigners own $31 trillion. That's 1.5 times US GDP. Now this, under any circumstances or under any analysis, is far too much. So, the problem is, how do we stop them selling it? And the only way we stop them selling it is to pay them enough interest for them to hang on to their dollars. But that destroys the markets. And this is why I feel that it's a very different scenario as far as assets are concerned this time round. Financial assets in particular, but it's also true of, residential property, other property, and so on and so forth. I mean, I can remember, not even in this sort of situation, but back in 1975 in this country, when the banks were bust, you could have bought an office block in London, in the city, for nothing. Why? Because somebody had to pay money to keep the utilities going in that office block. And that is the sort of situation which we run towards when money actually buys you nothing. I think the way it will come out of it is that central banks can only do one thing. You have the collapse. It's not total. At some stage, the central banks say, we've got to mobilize our gold reserves. And they then turn their fiat currency into credible, I mean, it'll have to be credible, gold substitute. That will stabilize the situation. But we're talking about, perhaps in dollars, a gold price of over $300,000 or something like that. I mean, this is a long way from where we are now, but it can happen very, very rapidly.
I lived in London for a while, and I know the property ladder is almost religious fervor. Is that mentality changing in the UK, or are people still dying to get on the property ladder?
They're still dying to get onto the property ladder, and this COVID thing and the suspension of stamp duty has just driven prices up hugely. But I also note that property prices in America have driven up. It's, if you like, the initial effect, I think, of monetary debasement. But there will be that secondary effect when the debasement really hits, and people then begin to think, well, I've got an investment property here. I've got to sell it in order to. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, we got it. Okay, you got to hit it. Thanks so much, Alasdair Macleod from GoldMoney.com for being on Keiser Report.
That's my pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Alasdair Macleod of GoldMoney.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.